A joke. It was a bright winter midday. There was a sharp, snapping frost, and the curls on. Nadenka's temples and the down on her upper lip were covered with silvery frost. She was holding my arm, and we were standing on a high hill. From where we stood to the ground below there stretched a smooth, sloping descent, in which the sun was reflected as in a looking-glass. Beside us was a little sledge lined with bright red cloth. "Let us go down, Nadia Petrovna," I besought her. "Only once. I assure you we shall be all right and not hurt." But Nadenka was afraid. The slope from her little galoshes to the bottom of the ice hill seemed to her a terrible, immensely deep abyss. Her spirit failed her, and she held her breath as she looked down, when I merely suggested her getting into the sledge. But what would it be if she were to risk flying into the abyss? She would die. She would go out of her mind. "I entreat you," I said. "You mustn't be afraid. You know it's poor-spirited. It's cowardly." Nadenka gave way at last, and from her face I saw that she gave way in mortal dread. I sat her in the sledge, pale and trembling, put my arm round her, and with her cast myself down the precipice. The sledge flew like a bullet. The air cleft by our flight beat in our faces, roared, whistled in our ears, tore at us, nipped us cruelly in its anger, tried to tear our heads off our shoulders. We had hardly strength to breathe from the pressure of the wind. It seemed as though the devil himself had caught us in his claws and was dragging us with a roar to hell. Surrounding objects melted into one long, furiously racing streak. Another moment, and it seemed we should perish. "I love you, Nadia," I said in a low voice. The sledge began moving more and more slowly. The roar of the wind and the whir of the runners was no longer so terrible. It was easier to breathe, and at last we were at the bottom. Nadenka was more dead than alive. She was pale and scarcely breathing. I helped her to get up. "Nothing would induce me to go again," she said, looking at me with wide eyes full of horror. "Nothing in the world. I almost died." A little later she recovered herself and looked inquiringly into my eyes, wondering had I really uttered those 4 words, or had she fancied them in the roar of the hurricane. And I stood beside her, smoking and looking attentively at my glove. She took my arm, and we spent a long while walking near the ice hill. The riddle evidently would not let her rest. Had those words been uttered or not? Yes or no? Yes or no? It was a question of pride or honor, of life, a very important question. The most important question in the world. Nadenka kept impatiently, sorrowfully looking into my face with a penetrating glance. She answered at random, waiting to see whether I would not speak. Oh, the play of feeling on that sweet face. I saw that she was struggling with herself, that she wanted to say something, to ask some question, but she could not find the words. She felt awkward and frightened and troubled by her joy. "Do you know what?" she said without looking at me. "Well," I asked, "let us slide down again." We clambered up the ice hill by the steps again. I sat Nadenka, pale and trembling, in the sledge. Again we flew into the terrible abyss. Again the wind roared in the runners. Word. And again, when the flight of our sledge was at its swiftest and noisiest, I said in a low voice, "I love you, Nadenka." When the sledge stopped, Nadenka flung a glance at the hill down which we had both slid, then bent a long look upon my face, listened to my voice, which was unconcerned and passionless, and the whole of her little figure, every bit of it, even her muff and her hood, expressed the utmost bewilderment, and on her face was written, "What does it mean?" Who uttered those underscore words? Did he, or did I only fancy it? The uncertainty worried her and drove her out of all patience. The poor girl did not answer my questions, frowned, and was on the point of tears. "Hadn't we better go home?" I asked. "Well, I like this tobogganing," she said, flushing. Shall we go down once more? She liked the tobogganing, and yet as she got into the sled she was as both times. Before, pale, trembling, hardly able to breathe for terror. We went down for the third time, and I saw she was looking at my face and watching my lips. But I put my handkerchief to my lips, coughed, and when we reached the middle of the hill I succeeded in bringing out, I love you, Nadia. And the mystery remained a mystery. Nadenka was silent, pondering on something. I saw her home. She tried to walk slowly, slackened her pace, and kept waiting to see whether I would not say those words to her. And I saw how her soul was suffering what effort she was making not to say to herself. It cannot be that the wind said them, and I don't want it to be the wind that said them. Next morning I got a little note. If you are tobogganing today, come for me. And from that time I began going every day tobogganing with Nadenka, and as we flew down in the sledge, every time I pronounced in a low voice the same words. I love you, Nadia. Soon Nadenka grew used to that phrase as to alcohol or morphia. She could not live without it. It is true that flying down the ice hill terrified her as before, but now the terror and danger gave a peculiar fascination to words of love, words which as before were a mystery and tantalized the soul. The same to the wind and I were still suspected. Which of the two was making love to her she did not know, but apparently by now she did not care, from which goblet one drinks matters little, if only the beverage is intoxicating. It happened I went to the skating ground alone at midday, mingling with the crowd. I saw Nadenka go up to the ice hill and look about for me. Then she timidly mounted the steps